You're 50 years old, or close to it. And somewhere, late at night, scrolling through your phone, a number flashed in front of you. A number that supposedly represents where you should be by now. Maybe it made your stomach drop. Maybe you closed the app and told yourself you'd check it tomorrow. Tomorrow never came, did it? Here's the truth nobody tells you before you turn 40. Money isn't just math, it's memory. It's every year you worked overtime instead of watching your kids' game. Every vacation you didn't take. Every raise you didn't ask for because you were taught not to make waves. So when I tell you the average American has a certain amount saved by 50, I need you to breathe first, because that number is going to surprise you. Some of you will feel relief. Others will feel something closer to grief. Both reactions are honest. Both are allowed. Stay with me. What comes next might change how you look at every dollar you have left to save. Let's start with the number. The one that keeps people up at night. According to data most financial institutions track year after year, the average American between the ages of 45 and 54 has somewhere around $115,000 saved in retirement accounts. That's the average. Write that down if you need to. $115,000. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. The median. The number that represents what most people actually have, not what the wealthiest few pull the average toward, is far lower, often less than half of that average figure. Sometimes closer to $40,000 or $50,000. Let that sit for a second, because averages lie. Not on purpose, but mathematically, they lie. If you have 99 people with $20,000 saved, and one person with 10 million, the average suddenly looks like everyone's doing great. Everyone's not doing great. 99 people are still standing exactly where they started. This is the first thing I need you to understand before we go any further tonight. When someone throws around a national average like it's a report card, they're often showing you a distorted mirror. A mirror shaped by hedge fund managers, inherited wealth, and a handful of outliers who happen to buy the right stock at the right time. You are not those people. Neither am I. So when you hear the average American has this much saved by 50, and you feel that quiet panic rising in your chest, pause. Ask yourself, average or median? Because those two words carry two very different stories. The median tells you what real life actually looks like. A single mom working 2 jobs. A man who spent 15 years paying off a business that failed. A couple who raised 3 kids on a single income while prices kept climbing and wages didn't. That's not weakness. That's not failure. That's most of America. Now, add net worth to the picture. Not just retirement accounts, but home equity, some savings, maybe a paid-off car. For Americans in their late 40s to mid-50s, median net worth tends to hover somewhere in the range of $160,000 to $200,000. Again, median. Not average. Not the number Wall Street likes to wave around in ads that make you feel like you should already own 2 vacation homes. Here's something I want you to notice about yourself right now. When you heard those numbers, did you feel behind? Or did you feel, for a second, like maybe you're not as far off as you thought? Both reactions tell you something. Not about your bank account, about the story you've been carrying about yourself. Because here's what nobody explains clearly enough. The gap between average and median isn't just a statistics lesson. It's an emotional weapon. Financial media uses the inflated average number because it drives clicks, drives shame, drives people to buy courses and subscribe to newsletters promising to close a gap that was exaggerated from the start. I'm not here to sell you shame tonight. I'm here to show you the real picture, because the real picture, as sobering as it is something you can actually work with. Shame doesn't build wealth. Clarity does. So let's go deeper. Let's talk about where these numbers come from, why they vary so wildly depending on which financial institution or survey you're looking at, and why comparing yourself to a nationwide figure might be one of the most misleading things you can do with your Tuesday night. Because your zip code isn't the national average. Your health isn't the national average. Your family situation isn't the national average. And yet, so many of us lay awake measuring our worth, literally, against a number that was never built to describe us specifically. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your whole life working hard, paying your bills, showing up for your family, and still feeling like you're failing some invisible test nobody explained the rules to. I've felt that exhaustion. Maybe you have too. But here's the shift I want to offer you before we move into the next part of this conversation. Being behind the average isn't the same as being behind in life. Sometimes it just means you spent your money on things averages don't measure. Time with your parents before they passed, a roof that kept your family warm, a kid's education you paid for out of pocket instead of debt. None of that shows up in a retirement account balance, but it shows up in a life. Still, I'm not going to pretend numbers don't matter. They do, because in a few years, those numbers determine whether you can retire with dignity or whether you're still working at 70 because you have no other option. So let's stop looking at the scary headline number and start looking at what actually matters for you. Specifically, going into the next chapter of your life. That's where we're headed next. Let's talk about the word behind. It's a heavy word. It carries weight most people don't realize until they say it out loud about their own life. I'm behind. Behind who? Behind what? Behind a number some financial firm calculated using data from people whose lives look nothing like yours? Here's something I've come to believe after years of watching people torture themselves with comparison. Behind is often a trap disguised as motivation. It feels like it's pushing you forward, but most of the time, it's just making you feel smaller. And a smaller person doesn't make better financial decisions. A smaller person panics. A smaller person either freezes completely or makes a desperate, risky move trying to catch up overnight. So before we talk about benchmarks, I want you to release the idea that there's one single finish line every American is supposed to cross by 50. There isn't. Someone living in rural Ohio with a paid-off house has an entirely different financial reality than someone renting in San Francisco making twice the salary. Someone who started working at 18 has a different trajectory than someone who went back to school at 35 after raising kids. Someone carrying medical debt from a health crisis is playing an entirely different game than someone who's been lucky enough to stay healthy their whole life. Averages don't know your story. They can't. So instead of asking, am I behind the national average? A better question, a more honest question, is this: am I on track relative to my own income, my own expenses, my own timeline? This is where income multiple benchmarks come in. And I want to walk you through this slowly, because this is where things actually start to feel useful instead of just alarming. A common rule of thumb among financial planners suggests that by age 50, having somewhere around 6 times your annual salary saved for retirement puts you in a reasonably strong position. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but reasonable. So if you're earning $70,000 a year, that means aiming for something around $420,000 saved. If you're earning $100,000, that number climbs to $600,000. Now, I want you to notice something. Even this better benchmark still might feel intimidating. And that's okay. That feeling is allowed to exist. But here's the difference. This number is tied to your actual life, your actual income, your actual circumstances. It's not a fantasy number pulled from a headline designed to make you click. And even this benchmark comes with an asterisk, because it doesn't account for whether you'll have a pension. It doesn't account for whether your house will be paid off by then, lowering your monthly expenses dramatically. It doesn't account for whether you plan to work part-time in your 60s instead of stopping entirely, which more and more people are choosing to do, not out of desperation, but out of genuine desire to stay engaged, stay useful, stay sharp. This is the real conversation that never happens on those flashy finance channels obsessed with shock value. Retirement isn't one single number. It's a puzzle made of several pieces: your savings, your home equity, your health, your family support system, your ability to keep earning in some capacity if you choose to. I've met people with what looks like a low retirement account balance who are genuinely at peace because their mortgage is paid off, their kids are independent, and their expenses are modest. And I've met people with what looks like an impressive account balance who are terrified because they're still carrying debt, still supporting adult children, still living in a high-cost area with no plan to relocate. The number alone tells you almost nothing. The context tells you everything. So here's what I want you to actually do, not someday, but this week. Calculate your own income multiple. Take what you currently have saved across all your retirement and investment accounts. Divide it by your annual income. That's your personal number. Compare it to where you want to be, not to a stranger's average, not to your neighbor's Facebook vacation photos, not to some influencer flexing a number that may or may not even be real. Because here's the deeper truth hiding underneath all of this. The people who obsess over the national average are often the same people who never take the 10 minutes required to calculate their own actual number. It's easier to feel bad about a vague headline than to face your specific, personal reality. But facing it is where the power is. Facing it is where you stop being a passenger in your own financial life and start being the one steering. So take a breath. Whatever your number is right now, whatever came to mind while I was talking, that's your starting point. Not your final grade. Not your verdict. Your starting point. And starting points, no matter how late they seem, are still something you can build from. Which brings us to the part of this conversation I think you actually came here for. Not the shame. Not the comparison. The mistakes. The specific, repeatable mistakes that quietly keep so many hardworking, well-intentioned Americans further behind than they needed to be. Let's talk about those next. Mistake number 1, lifestyle creep. You know this one even if you've never heard the term before. It's the slow, almost invisible upgrade of your life that happens every time your income goes up. You get a raise, and suddenly, the car feels a little outdated. You get a promotion, and suddenly the house feels a little small. You start earning more, and somehow, mysteriously, you never actually feel richer. I want to be careful here, because this isn't a lecture about avocado toast or your morning coffee. That narrative has always been a little insulting, honestly. blaming ordinary pleasures for a systemic problem. This is bigger than coffee. Lifestyle creep is what happens when every dollar of increased income gets absorbed by increased spending before it ever reaches a savings account. A bigger house means a bigger mortgage, bigger property taxes, more furniture to fill it. A better car means a bigger payment, more insurance, more maintenance. None of these choices feel reckless in the moment. Each one feels reasonable, deserved even. But 10 years pass, 20 years pass, and the income kept climbing, but the net worth barely moved, because the lifestyle climbed right alongside it, dollar for dollar. Here's the quiet fix, and it's not about deprivation. It's about a simple rule some of the wealthiest, most financially secure people I've studied over the years actually live by. When your income increases, let your savings rate increase first, before your lifestyle does, even if it's just half of the raise. Save half. Live on the rest. Your life still improves. It just doesn't consume the entire gain. Mistake number 2, not taking the full employer match. If your workplace offers a retirement match, meaning they contribute money to your account when you do, and you're not contributing enough to get the full match, you are quite literally leaving guaranteed money on the table. Not risky money. Not maybe money. Free money, sitting there, waiting for you to claim it. I've talked to people who went years, sometimes a decade or more, contributing just enough to get by, unaware they were missing thousands upon thousands of dollars in matched contributions. Not because they were careless people, because nobody ever sat them down and explained, clearly, what that match actually meant in real dollar terms over time. If you're not sure whether you're getting your full match right now, that's worth checking this week. Not someday. This week. Because every year you miss it is a year that money can never work for you again. It's not just lost contribution. It's lost decades of compound growth on top of that contribution. Mistake number 3. Starting late, and then punishing yourself for starting late instead of just starting. This one is more emotional than the first two, but it might be the most damaging. So many people in their 40s and 50s carry a kind of shame around not having started investing sooner. Maybe you were paying off student loans. Maybe you were supporting family members. Maybe you simply didn't understand how any of this worked, because nobody taught you, and admitting that felt embarrassing. That shame becomes paralysis. And paralysis is far more expensive than a late start. Because here's the mathematical truth that shame conveniently hides from you. The second most powerful moment to start investing was 20 years ago. But the single most powerful moment to start is always today. Not because today makes up for lost time completely. It doesn't. And I won't insult you by pretending it does. But because every year you wait afterward compounds that loss further. The people who end up in the worst position by 65 aren't usually the ones who started late. They're the ones who started late, felt ashamed about it, and let that shame convince them it was already too late to bother. So they never started at all. That's the real trap, not the late start. The decision, made quietly out of embarrassment, to never start. There's a fourth pattern I'll mention briefly, even though it wasn't on our original list, because it ties all 3 of these together, and that's high-interest debt sitting alongside long-term savings, carrying a credit card balance at 20+% interest while simultaneously trying to invest for retirement is like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain wide open. The math almost never favors that approach. Paying down high-interest debt first, aggressively, before ramping up discretionary investing, is one of the most underrated financial moves available to anyone, at any age. Now, notice something about all three of these mistakes. None of them are about intelligence. None of them are about laziness. They're about information, timing, and unexamined habits quietly running in the background of an otherwise responsible life, which means they're fixable, not instantly, not painlessly, but fixable. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Because knowing the mistakes means nothing if we don't talk about what actually changes when you start correcting course today, even if today feels embarrassingly late. Let's talk about what actually happens when you start today. Not someday. Not when things settle down. Today, in whatever form that takes for you. This week, this paycheck, this decision. Here's a number that tends to quiet the panic in people's chests when I explain it clearly. If you're 50 years old and you start investing just $500 a month, assuming a modest average return over time, by the time you reach 65, you could realistically be looking at somewhere in the range of $200,000 to $250,000. Not because of some secret trick, because of time, consistency, and the quiet, unglamorous power of compound growth. Compound growth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel exciting in year 1 or year 3 or even year 7. It feels almost disappointingly slow. And that slowness is exactly why so many people give up before the momentum actually kicks in. Because the real growth, the dramatic growth, tends to happen in the final stretch, not the beginning. Think of it like planting a tree you won't sit under for a decade. The first few years it barely looks different. You water it, you wait, nothing seems to be happening. And then, almost suddenly, it's tall enough to offer shade. Money works the same way. The first few years of consistent investing often feel invisible. Then, somewhere around year 8, 9, 10, the growth starts compounding on itself in a way that finally becomes visible, tangible, real. This is why starting today, even a modest amount, matters so much more than people realize. Not because it fixes everything instantly, because it buys you time. And time is the one resource money genuinely cannot replace. Now let's talk about catch-up contributions, because this is something the tax code actually built specifically for people your age. And most people don't even know it exists. Once you turn 50, the government allows you to contribute more to retirement accounts than younger workers are permitted to. Significantly more, in some accounts. This isn't a loophole, it's a deliberate acknowledgement built into the system that people often need to accelerate savings in their 50s. Whether because they started late, took time off to raise children, or simply hit their stride financially later in life. If you're not using catch-up contributions and you're eligible, that's another quiet gap worth closing. Because this window doesn't stay open forever. It's specifically designed for this exact decade of your life. Let's also talk about the other side of the equation. Not just adding money, but reducing what leaks out. I want you to think about one single recurring expense in your life right now. Not something dramatic, something small, a subscription you forgot you had, a premium package you don't fully use, an insurance policy you haven't shopped around for in 5 years. Now imagine redirecting just that one expense, say $150 a month, into an investment account instead. Over 15 years, even at modest returns, that single redirected expense could grow into tens of thousands of dollars. One decision. One overlooked leak. Sealed. This is the part of the conversation where fear is supposed to turn into motion. Not blind optimism. Not toxic positivity pretending everything is fine. Just clear, grounded motion. Because here's the emotional shift I want to offer you. So much of the anxiety around retirement savings comes from feeling like the outcome is already decided, like the story's been written, and you're just watching it play out helplessly. But that's not true. Every single month between now and whenever you choose to slow down is another chance to shift the trajectory. Not erase the past. Shift what's still ahead. 50 isn't the ending chapter of your financial story. It's often the chapter where the story actually gets more interesting, because now you have clarity you didn't have at 30. You know what actually matters. You know which expenses bring you joy and which ones were just noise. You've likely paid off some debts, maybe finished raising kids, maybe hit a stride in your career that pays more than it ever has. That combination, clarity plus capability, is more powerful than people your age tend to give themselves credit for. So, if there's one thing I want sitting with you as we move into the next part of this conversation, it's this. Catching up isn't about frantic, desperate moves. It's about steady, deliberate redirection, starting now, compounding quietly in the background of your life while you keep living it. And speaking of living it, let's talk about how different generations are actually approaching this exact moment, because the comparison might surprise you. Let's talk generations, because this is where things get genuinely interesting, and a little more complicated than the internet likes to admit. Start with the boomers, the generation currently moving through their 60s and 70s, many of them at or approaching the finish line of their careers. On paper, boomers tend to hold the highest median retirement savings and net worth of any generation, often reporting balances well above $200,000 by their late 50s and beyond. But here's the layer underneath that number. Boomers largely benefited from a different economic landscape. Pensions were more common, home prices relative to income were dramatically lower, and college costs hadn't yet exploded into the burden they've become. Their advantage isn't purely about better decisions. It's partly about better timing in a system that has shifted significantly since. That matters, because comparing yourself to boomer numbers without acknowledging that context can create an unfair, almost impossible standard. Now, Gen X, the generation currently sitting mostly in their late 40s through late 50s. This is the group most directly targeted by tonight's conversation. And their financial story is, frankly, one of the most under-discussed in mainstream finance media. Gen X came of age during the shift away from pensions toward 401k accounts, meaning they were among the first generation forced to essentially build their own retirement from scratch, often without adequate financial education to do it well. Many entered the workforce during the early 90s, weathered the dot-com collapse in their 20s, the 2008 financial crisis right in their prime saving years, and now find themselves supporting both aging parents and, in many cases, adult children still living at home or needing financial help. It's no surprise, then, that Gen X often reports feeling the most financially squeezed of any generation, despite frequently having moderate to solid savings on paper. They're the sandwich generation in every sense, financially, emotionally, and practically. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Your stress isn't a personal failing. It's a structural reality of the specific decades you've lived through. You inherited a system in transition, and you've largely had to figure it out without a map. Then there are the millennials, many of whom are now entering their 40s, standing at the edge of the exact conversation we are having tonight, watching it with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Millennials, statistically, are behind where Gen X and Boomers were at the same age, largely due to entering the workforce during the 2008 recession, carrying historically high student loan debt, and facing housing costs that have outpaced wage growth in almost every major city in the country. But, and this is important, millennials also tend to start investing earlier than previous generations did, largely because access to information has improved dramatically. Robo-advisors, low-cost index funds, financial content readily available online. All of this gives younger millennials tools previous generations simply didn't have at the same age. So here's the real picture emerging from this generational comparison, and it's more nuanced than which generation is winning, even though that makes for a great comment section debate. Boomers had better timing, but less access to information early on. Gen X had worse timing and less support, but developed resilience through repeated economic shocks. Millennials have better tools and information, but face steeper costs and later starts in almost every major financial milestone. Buying homes, having children, building initial savings. Every generation is fighting a different version of the same fight. And here's what I think gets lost in all the generational finger-pointing that dominates social media. None of you chose the economic conditions you were born into. Not the interest rates, not the job market, not the housing prices, not the cost of a college degree the year you turned 18. What you do control is what happens from this point forward. Your generation's disadvantages don't disappear by comparing yourself to another generation's advantages. They only disappear, or at least soften, through the specific, deliberate actions we've already talked about tonight. Closing your income gap, taking your full match, using catch-up contributions, redirecting one leaking expense into growth. The generational comparison is fascinating. It's validating even to realize your struggle has structural roots, not just personal ones. But it's not where the solution lives. The solution lives in the same place it's always lived, in what you do with the years you actually have left, starting now. And that brings us to something I want to say directly to you, because we've covered a lot of ground tonight. And I don't want to move forward without pausing here for a moment first. There's another layer to this conversation that almost never gets its own spotlight, even though it might shape your number more than your generation ever did. Marital status, household structure, who's standing next to you, or not. When these decisions get made, married couples, statistically, tend to reach 50 with significantly higher combined retirement savings than single adults of the same age. Part of that is simple math. 2 incomes, shared housing costs, 1 mortgage instead of 2. But part of it is something quieter. Decision-making becomes shared. One partner's oversight gets caught by the other. One partner's moment of panic gets steadied by someone else in the room. That's not a judgment on anyone who's built a life alone. It's just an honest acknowledgement that solo households carry every fixed cost, rent, insurance, utilities, without anyone to split it with. And that adds up quietly over decades in a way spreadsheets rarely explain out loud. Then there's divorce, which shows up in these numbers more than almost any other single event. Financial researchers have long pointed to divorce, especially later in life, as one of the sharpest disruptions to retirement savings a person can experience. Splitting a retirement account in half doesn't just cut the number. It often forces someone back into renting after decades of ownership, restarts a savings timeline that had 30 years of momentum, and does all of this precisely during the years when there's the least amount of runway left to rebuild. If that's your story, I want to say something plainly. You didn't fall behind because you were careless. You fell behind because life happened to you the way it happens to almost everyone eventually, in one form or another. A marriage ending isn't a financial failure. It's a life event with a financial cost attached, and those are two very different things, even though they get talked about as if they're the same. Widowhood carries its own version of this weight, often heavier because it arrives without warning and without negotiation. Suddenly, one income disappears, but the mortgage doesn't. The insurance premiums don't. The habits built around two people planning a future together don't just quietly adjust themselves overnight. Grief and financial recalculation end up sharing the same exhausted mind, often at the same kitchen table, often in the same sleepless week. And then there's a group that gets almost no attention in these conversations at all. People who never married, by choice or by circumstance, who've spent decades building a life that doesn't fit the two-income household model these benchmarks quietly assume. If that's you, you've likely noticed that most retirement calculators, most benchmark charts, most financial advice columns are written with a married couple in mind by default. You've had to translate every piece of generic advice into a version that actually applies to your life, and nobody ever acknowledged how much extra work that translation takes. Here's what I want you to take from all of this, because it connects directly to everything we've already covered tonight. Your household structure isn't a footnote. It's one of the biggest hidden variables in whether your number looks like the benchmark or falls short of it. And it's almost never your fault when it does. A single parent who raised 2 kids alone on one income and still managed to put anything away for retirement did something quietly remarkable, even if the final balance looks modest next to a dual-income household that never had to make those same sacrifices. A person who rebuilt from zero after a divorce in their late 40s is playing a harder version of this game than someone who's been married 30 years with 2 steady paychecks the entire time. None of this shows up in a national average. None of it shows up in a headline. But it shows up in your life, every single month, whether anyone else acknowledges it or not. So if you've been comparing your number to a benchmark that quietly assumes a household that doesn't look like yours, I want you to set that comparison down right now. Not because your number doesn't matter, because the comparison was never fair to begin with. What matters is the same thing it's always been tonight, not the shape of the household you're standing in, but what you do, starting now, with the specific life you actually have. And that brings me to something I want to say directly to you, one person to another, before we go any further. If you're still here with me, this deep into the conversation, this many minutes in, that tells me something about you. It tells me you're not looking for a quick fix or a flashy headline. You're looking for the real picture. And that already puts you ahead of most people who click away after the first 2 minutes looking for something easier to swallow. So let me ask you to do one small thing before we keep going. If this channel, this conversation, feels like the kind of honest, grounded voice you want in your corner as you navigate the next chapter of your financial life, subscribe. Come back tomorrow and the day after that. We talk about this stuff here every single day, not because it's trendy, but because most people your age were never given a real, honest map for any of this. I'd like to keep building that map with you. Now, here's something I want to say directly, one person to another, not as a script, but as something I genuinely believe. Most of you didn't get here by being reckless. You got here by working, by showing up, by trying to do right by the people who depend on you. And somewhere along the way, a system that was never designed to make this easy convinced a lot of good, hard-working people that they were somehow behind in a race nobody explained the rules to. I don't believe that about you. I hope, by now, you're starting not to believe it either. Let's get back to it, because there's one more piece of this puzzle we haven't touched yet, and it might be the most important one of the entire conversation. We've talked about numbers, about mistakes, about generations, but we haven't talked about the single biggest predictor of whether someone actually closes their gap in the next 10 to 15 years. And it's not intelligence, and it's not income. It's consistency under boredom. That sounds strange, maybe even underwhelming, after everything we've covered. But stay with me, because this might be the most honest thing I say to you tonight. The people who end up financially secure by 65, regardless of where they started at 50, are almost never the ones who made one brilliant, dramatic move. They're the ones who did something unremarkable over and over for years without needing applause for it. They contributed the same modest amount every single month, even during the years the market dropped and every instinct told them to stop. They kept the emergency fund untouched, even when a shinier temptation showed up. They renewed the same unglamorous, boring habits long after the initial motivation that started them had faded completely. Boring is the secret nobody wants to hear, because boring doesn't sell courses, and boring doesn't go viral. But boring, repeated for a decade, quietly becomes the difference between working until you're 78 out of necessity and choosing, freely, when you want to slow down. I think about the people I've known who built real security later in life. Not flashy wealth, just genuine, steady security. And almost none of them have a dramatic story. They just kept showing up, paycheck after paycheck, year after year. Nothing photogenic about it. Nothing you'd want to post online. But it worked. It's still working, quietly, for people doing it right now while we're having this conversation. So as we move toward closing tonight, I don't want to leave you with some big, dramatic 5-step plan you'll forget by tomorrow morning. I want to leave you with something smaller, something you can actually hold on to. The gap you're worried about. The one that brought you to this video in the first place. It isn't closed by panic. It isn't closed by comparing yourself to a stranger's average, or a boomer's timing, or a younger coworker's head start. It's closed the same way anything worthwhile gets built. Slowly, quietly, without an audience. One unremarkable month at a time. And that's exactly where I want to take you in these final minutes. Because there's a version of your future, 10 or 15 years from now, that's already being shaped by the decision you make about tonight's conversation. Not the video. The decision. What you do in the next 24 hours after hearing this. Let's finish this together. Here's what I know. After everything we've walked through tonight, the average American doesn't have as much saved by 50 as the headlines want you to fear. But the average American also isn't you. You're not a statistic scraped from a nationwide survey. You're a person who's been carrying decisions, sacrifices, and quiet victories that no spreadsheet will ever capture. Maybe you started late. Maybe you missed a few years of matching contributions you didn't even know existed. Maybe lifestyle crept up on you slowly enough that you never noticed it happening until tonight, hearing it named out loud for the first time. Maybe you're the one who paid for someone else's emergency instead of your own future, and you'd do it again tomorrow if you had to. None of that is the end of your story. It's just the middle of it. Because here's what's true. Whether you're a boomer who got lucky with timing, a Gen Xer who's been quietly carrying the weight of 2 generations at once, or a millennial just now feeling the ground shift beneath you as 50 stops being a number that belongs to someone else and starts being a number that belongs to you. The next 15 years haven't been written yet. You get to decide what the next chapter looks like, not by making one dramatic move tomorrow morning, but by making the same small, unremarkable decision over and over, long after it stops feeling exciting. That's it. That's the whole secret. There was never a bigger one hiding underneath, no matter how many people try to sell you one. I think about all the people who'll watch this tonight, scattered across different states, different kitchens, different quiet moments before bed, phone light on their face while everyone else in the house is already asleep. Some of you feel a little lighter than when you pressed play. Some of you feel the weight of years you can't get back. Both of those feelings are allowed to sit in the same chest at the same time. That's not contradiction. That's just what it means to be a grown adult looking honestly at your own life. I'm not going to tell you everything will be fine. I don't know your specific numbers. I don't know your health, your family, the surprises still waiting for you around some corner none of us can see yet. Anyone who promises you certainty on a topic like this one is selling you something. And it isn't peace of mind. What I do know is this. The people who close the gap aren't the ones who never fell behind. They're the ones who stopped measuring themselves against a stranger's average and started paying attention to their own actual number, their own actual month, their own actual next decision. They stopped waiting for the year everything would finally feel figured out, and started moving anyway, a little unsure, a little late, but moving. That's available to you. Right now. Tonight. Whatever time it is wherever you're listening from, whether it's still light outside your window or long past when you should have gone to bed. If this conversation gave you something, even one moment of clarity, even one number that shifted something in your chest, even just permission to stop comparing yourself to a mirror that was never built to reflect you accurately. Do something small for me. Follow this channel so we can keep having conversations like this one day after day for as long as you need them. We're not going anywhere. And if you know someone who needs to hear this tonight, a brother still avoiding his statements, a friend who mentioned feeling behind at the last barbecue, a coworker carrying more than they let on, a spouse who changes the subject every time retirement comes up. Send this to 5 people. Not because I need the numbers. Because someone out there is lying awake with the exact fear we spent this last hour walking through together. And they don't know yet that the fear was built on a distorted number in the first place. Leave a comment below, honestly, about where you actually stand tonight. Not to compare. Not to compete. Just to say it out loud, maybe for the first time, in a place where nobody's going to judge you for it. And tell me what you want us to unpack next. Because this channel exists for exactly this. For the conversations nobody else is having with you, plainly. Without the shame, without the sales pitch, without pretending any of this is simpler than it actually is. I'll be here tomorrow. Same time. Same honesty. Same refusal to talk down to you. Until then, take care of the number that actually matters. Yours.